Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for this Columbia Climate School Professional Learning Program info session. My name is Cassie, and you've likely all heard from me by now with information about our fall 2021 workshops. Thank you today for joining us to learn a little bit more about Dr. Joshua Fisher's workshop on conservation and strategies for strategic collaborative conservation and strategies for biodiversity. And I just wanted to give everybody a quick overview of our non-degree programs to start. So some of you might be new to the climate school. If this is your first time hearing from us, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So the climate school was announced in July 2020, and it is actually the first new school to be established at Columbia University in 25 years. We're very much excited to come together for this with the school. It's going to be really drawing on the strengths of across the university on climate and sustainability as one of the most challenging issues. Climate change is one of the most challenging issues we will face in our near futures. And the climate school is actually made up of various centers, and Joshua Fisher, who is teaching this workshop this fall on conservation and biodiversity, is the director of one of those centers, the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, AC4 for short. So these are non-degree programs. The professional learning offerings are non-credit workshops. You don't get a transcript. It's open enrollment. And it's really meant for individuals who are learning to either pivot in their careers to something that's climate and sustainability related, or it's a little additional professional development, or you're interested in a new topic. Whatever your reasons might be, these are really meant to be introductory workshops. You do take a deep dive into a lot of different topics, but many of our offerings, in fact, most of our offerings thus far under professional learning have been open enrollment with no prerequisites. They are led by the same instructors who teach in our degree programs and credit-bearing programs. So you are getting the exact same lectures and content that we offer in our degree programs. It's just that these are a little more flexible, and these take place in the evenings after work. And we are hoping that the flexibility will allow some additional participants to be able to join these workshops. Participants receive a certificate of participation from the Columbia Climate School, indicates the number of hours that you completed for the workshop. They are fee-based workshops, and we have discounted and reduced rate options available for different categories. And so today, you're going to hear, this is the info session for Dr. Fisher's workshop, which is starting in November. It'll be November 9th, Tuesdays, starting November 9th from 5:30 until 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the workshop will wrap up just in December, mid-December, so Tuesday, December 14th. And he's going to go over with you, he'll take about the next 15 minutes to go over the general idea of the workshop, what week to week looks like, what topics will be covered. We'll be using the Q&A box today. So if you do have any questions, feel free to type your questions in there throughout the session. And then once Josh is done, we are going to open it up for additional questions. And this is being recorded, and you'll all get a copy of the recording after. And if you do have any questions, again, just put it in that Q&A box. All right, Josh, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you, Cassie, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this fall workshop with everyone who joins. Just to give you a little bit of context for the workshop, I've been working in biodiversity and biodiversity conservation for about the last 15 or 16 years in a variety of capacities, usually using scientific services to support conservation planning, conservation management, and stakeholder conflict management in conservation settings. My own background, I come from an agricultural family where we confronted the realities of land use, stakeholder conflict, and biodiversity conservation sort of on the everyday basis. And I got really interested in finding ways to enable people to meet their economic needs while also safeguarding ecosystem services and ecosystems and species that provide some of the foundation for those livelihoods. But in places that are water stressed, in places that are climate stressed, in places around the world where different stakeholder interests are coming into play, we see a lot of conflict. That's not because most stakeholders or most actors are malicious and want to actively destroy biodiversity. Instead, it's that every stakeholder has their own approach to interacting in the natural world, interacting with each other in the natural world. And often people's incentives and agendas aren't exactly aligned. And so we get these misalignments that cause a lot of conflict. And that conflict can be rather docile, anything from just a disagreement to pretty virulent, up to and including violence. And so the question is, how can we manage natural resources and how can we manage biodiversity to enable stakeholders to meet their interests and needs and really safeguard the ecosystems that they depend on, and that they live in and that they care for and that they're interested in conserving. And so that's what this course is exploring. It's really exploring how do we practically engage in biodiversity conservation, confronting the climate realities, confronting the biodiversity crisis, confronting the changing policy landscape and issues around equity, inclusion, diversity, which tend to have been omitted from the conservation discourse up until now. And so the course is going to touch on a lot of things, but it's going to be really practically oriented. I've supported conservation initiatives in the Amazon basin, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Western United States, and the Pacific Islands. And there are absolutely nuances to each culture, each context, each set of stakeholders. And there are some common trends on how these complex social ecological systems function that we can use to understand some of the broad boundaries of the system and then tailor biodiversity conservation initiatives to that local nuance and context. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give you a sense of what the course involves. Again, the name of the course is Collaborative Conservation Strategies for Biodiversity. And as Cassie mentioned, I'm the director of AC4, the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. So the workshop has 4 main objectives. First, to understand major trends in conservation and land management initiatives. So what's happening in the biodiversity landscape? What's happening in terms of species loss, species gain? What's happening in terms of habitat loss? But also what's happening in terms of initiatives to safeguard biodiversity. So the first objective of the course, or the first major tranche of the course, is going to focus on these trends in conservation. And that'll help us situate some of the dilemmas that conservation is facing. Next, we'll use that grounded understanding to explore different theoretical frameworks to understand what drives collaboration and conflict among stakeholders, because stakeholder conflict or collaboration really determine or contribute to the conservation outcomes that we see. Next, after understanding those frameworks, what are the drivers in the systems? Then we'll become familiar with participatory planning and management models. If some of the dilemmas we face are based on incompatible needs and interests among stakeholders, then a participatory planning approach can help elicit what the stakeholder needs, interests are, where there are incompatibilities, and help us plan what to do to manage more collaboratively. And finally, we'll situate all of that in practical case studies from around the world on effective conservation action. So you'll get exposure to what works and what doesn't work in the field on the ground. So to go a little deeper into that, this is what the schedule will look like. It'll be a virtual workshop held Tuesdays from 5:30 to 8 p.m. unless otherwise indicated. We're running November 9th through the 14th. And each week we'll tackle a different set of those learning objectives, different set of issues. So we'll start with the trends, then we'll go into frameworks, then we'll go parse out conflict and collaboration, into 2 separate weeks, do a deep dive on planning, and then look at what's happening in the field more looking forward. And so just looking at some of the trends, rather than presenting statistics on, X species lost in this geography or X acres of or hectares of habitat gained, we're going to look at what are the underlying patterns. So what do those statistics or those numbers actually mean? There's a lot of evidence around protected areas being useful at or effective at delivering human well-being across the world. So not just safeguarding ecosystems, but also delivering social dividends. There are also trends on habitat conservation and land protection intersecting with warfare and wildlife declines. And also trends of conservation efforts overlapping with conflict, overlapping with species gain and habitat rewilding. So there's a lot happening in the conservation landscape. We're going to look at these trends. That'll be the first week. The next few weeks, we're going to focus on frameworks for conflict and collaboration, and that'll be based on a new book that's coming out that's grounded in the practical experience I have working with conservation organizations around the world to understand how to analyze conflict, how to analyze ecosystem needs and conservation targets, and how to plan effectively. So we'll break the next few weeks into a few different components. First, examining social ecological systems. We've all heard, or I hope we've all heard of the term, at least, complex system, which indicates many interconnected things, all changing in relation to each other over time in unpredictable ways. So social ecological systems are a specific class of complex systems that are based in place. So they have a geographic scope, a definable space. There are physical aspects defined by hydrology, geology, chemistry, biogeochemistry, etc. There are biological components, different sorts of life on multiple scales. And complexity, the interaction of all these things over time, and the timelines that each of these different processes function on and how those timelines do or don't overlap. And importantly, the social component. So social ecological systems are different from traditional or normal, ordinary complex systems in that they have this social component that includes laws and governance and individuals and groups and a whole lot of social complexity that really makes the complex system behave really, really unpredictably. And so trying to understand a social ecological system as opposed to just an ecosystem will be the first set of work we're going to look at. And we'll ground that in the resilience paradigm. Social ecological systems have been studied for a long time, including trying to understand how they evolve over time. And there are frameworks that we'll go over. This is called the complex adaptive cycle that describes periods of growth and stability and collapse and reorganization in an ecosystem. We'll adapt that to a social ecological system to understand how those changes and how different moments in the cycle either set us up for conflict, set us up for collaboration, institutional reorganization, and how we can help nudge the system toward a more collaborative space so that we can achieve our biodiversity outcomes. We'll go sort of deep into the social ecological system world to show that the same system can appear very different or can manifest in very different constellations depending on the factors at play. So the same system can look like a desert, it can look like a mountain landscape with pastoralists, it can look like an intact ecosystem devoid of people but starting to see intrusion and road construction, for instance, in the upper left example. But the same system can take on very different patterns based on the system dynamics. So we'll explore how social institutions sort of steer that trajectory and how we can use those to set and achieve our conservation targets. We'll ground that in the idea of conflict. where conflict is a real or perceived incompatibility in the needs, interests, positions, values, and objectives of multiple stakeholders. And so we'll set that in our social ecological system to show that a stakeholder or a group of stakeholders have their own sets of needs, interests, positions, things. But each stakeholder, each group of stakeholders has unique needs, interests, and positions. Sometimes those are really well aligned. Sometimes those are in conflict. When they're just hypothetically in conflict, I have an interest in the Amazon being intact. Communities who live near tropical hardwoods may have an interest in harvesting those tropical hardwoods. Our interests don't necessarily align, but we're not actually in conflict. Rather, conflict requires some change in the system that makes us come into contact with each other and makes those tensions real. So we'll look at conflict as a function of change in these systems and try and use that complex adaptive cycle to understand how change impacts systems. And this is important because conflict is just a way of describing social interaction. It's not good, it's not bad. It's a necessary component of life. And as we experience conflict, we have opportunities for innovation. But conflict becomes problematic when the institutions for managing inconsistencies, incompatibilities break down. And that's that collapse phase of the social ecological system. So we'll look at what happens to enable those to break down in ways that are destructive and ways that ultimately can be reconstructed to be more collaborative. The next phase of the workshop will move into the planning. And so this is a framework from the book that explains how we can use different types of participatory processes to understand the system trajectory over time, understand appropriate responses to accomplish social and ecological targets, and learn together as we implement biodiversity conservation programming. We'll ground this in a few case studies that I've worked on or my colleagues have worked on. For instance, collaborative governance of protected areas in the Amazon. To situate those different pieces of the planning process and the conflict management process to demonstrate how they can lead toward better biodiversity outcomes. We'll apply the different frameworks we've used to analyze cases like this, understand where the action points are or the levers of change are, so that we can better plan our conservation programs. And then I'll walk you through sort of in-depth, granular resolution, what this looks like in practice. All toward understanding how to create collaborative governance systems. And then we'll move into other case studies. Each week we'll have a different case study based on places that I've worked or my colleagues have worked. We'll try and invite some of our colleagues from the field into the workshop for discussions to share their knowledge and experience. But at least two of the cases we've worked on we'll touch on. One is management planning for buffer zones of protected areas. Buffer zones are important because they're sort of really complex spaces with multiple types of stakeholders, multiple types of laws and regulatory systems, multiple types of programming happening all at once from the private sector, public sector, et cetera. So they're really good case studies. But then we'll also look at other case studies around industrial mining in really important ecosystems to understand how we can leverage science in this planning process to help stakeholders identify different or alternative sets of options for their programming. And finally, we'll look at what's next. So the field is changing quite rapidly. The world and the crises that we're facing are changing quite rapidly. So the biodiversity and conservation fields need to change as well, both in terms of who's involved in the field, who's involved in the work on the ground, why certain groups are included, excluded, what can be done to create more inclusive conservation, but also how can we adjust our conservation programming to meet some of the international targets that have been set that are rapidly approaching the thresholds beyond which our conservation efforts might not be enough. So we'll look at what the future holds for conservation. And that is what we're going to try and accomplish in a few weeks together. So again, I'm really excited to have this workshop and have you in the workshop. Would love to hear your thoughts or take your questions or discuss more broadly.
Great, Josh, thank you. So I don't see questions at the moment, so I'm going to toss out a question here, and for our attendees, feel free to jump in. So Josh, if you could give us a sense of, you talked about some of these partners who you've worked with, and specific case studies, who might be some of the individuals that you might have attend the some of the workshops, just so the attendees have an idea of who else they might hear from about these real world sort of experiences and situations.
Yeah, thank you, Cassie. So conservation happens on multiple levels, from individual farmers to organizations like World Wildlife Fund or Conservation International, organizations that run these big global programs, to the international governance level like IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that sets the global conservation agenda. And so I've been working with colleagues at all these levels, and we'll be inviting in some of the people I've worked on the case studies with. For instance, Amazon Conservation is an excellent organization that has sort of 3 constituent organizations, all under the same umbrella, focused on conservation in Bolivia, conservation in Peru, and then an international liaising institution or organization based in Washington, DC. And I'll invite colleagues in from Amazon Conservation to share their experience on what works on the ground, what they've been doing, what challenges they've been facing, and how they have been overcoming those challenges, based on the makeup of the members of the workshop. That may happen in Spanish, it may happen in English with translation, or it may happen in English. And so we'll have to make some decisions around who to invite in and how to make it the most accessible it can be. But also we'll try and invite in colleagues who are working at the higher international level, either from Conservation International or IUCN, to give their understanding of the global field and directions of the field. And also there are organizations like the Association for Environmental Peace Building, organizations that are intentionally and explicitly trying to work on this intersectional issue or nexus of conflict and biodiversity and climate. So we'll get a range of sort of policy advocates, agenda setters, and practitioners.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a nice segue into the next question, which is from Patrick here, who's asking about practical applications. I think the external speakers is sort of one very great way to bring in practical applications, but Patrick has asked, what will you offer in terms of practical implementation, for example, potentially at schools or businesses, and what are some of the sort of lessons perhaps and strategies that we can apply to these different settings. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, so the approach that my partners and colleagues and I have taken is one of making the lessons learned in toolkits or planning guides and aids as accessible and open as possible. So part of the course materials includes lists and sets of planning guides and planning aids and toolkits that can be implemented, as well as case study material on lessons learned on how to implement and what the practical steps of implementation are. The shelves, both physical and virtual, are full of toolkits, and toolkits are great if you know how to use them, if you know what they're useful for. And so that's what this course is going to be aimed at, is how do you take something conceptual, something sort of high level, tailor it to the individual business, the individual landholder, the individual farmer, the constellation of stakeholders facing a crisis. So yeah, so it is practically oriented, using toolkits that practitioners are using in the field and showing how to couple multiple of those together to include in a planning process.
Great, thank you. And with just a couple of minutes left here, if anybody else has any additional questions, Josh, maybe you can help us wrap up here. I think the last thing to ask you is, in terms of who might be interested in taking the workshop, who it's targeted at, I talked about the fact that at the beginning, there's no prerequisite. So it's not like you have to work in conservation or biodiversity. But yeah, if you could talk a little bit maybe about who might get a lot out of the workshop, and who, there's obviously no perfect, candidate or anything, but I'm just curious who you think might find the workshop interesting, and get a lot out of it.
Yeah, great. So a couple different target constituencies, I guess, for the workshop, or not target, but constituencies and people who might benefit from it. Biodiversity professionals are really expert at their niche in the biodiversity conservation system. And this workshop will be sort of value additive for people in the conservation field already by providing them frameworks to grapple a little more effectively with the stakeholder landscape. So if you're a conservation professional, you'll definitely get more exposure to the social and institutional side of conservation. For people in the corporate world, one of the questions is that I get is always, great, we have something we need to do, and we don't want to do it badly. We don't want to do it with negative impacts on other people, but ultimately our objective is this: to make paper boxes or mine gold or produce recycled goods, or whatever it is. Our main focus isn't on biodiversity. Our main focus isn't on stakeholder collaboration, but this is useful in enabling them to engage stakeholders more broadly and align their own activities with other stakeholder interests, or enable them to work with stakeholders with diverging interests. And so instead of it being a sort of zero-sum game, it expands that pie.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, and a great way to wrap up. And we really hope that these professional learning opportunities are accessible and available to a wide range of professionals who are in different industries, because we cannot go alone at addressing climate and sustainability challenges if we solely just stay within our own disciplines. And I think this is a fantastic example of what we can do if we come together in an interdisciplinary way. So thank you, Josh, for your time. As I mentioned, we'll make this recording available. And should you have any more questions about the workshop, feel free to contact me. I will put my email just in the chat here quickly, but you should all have it. And if you have any additional questions for Josh about what the content he might cover is, definitely let us know. And Patrick has asked, how international is this class? So Patrick, are you asking the attendees in terms of where they're from, or the content of the case studies? And that those my attendees. Okay, great. So it really does vary with workshop to workshop, I would say. So we had last semester, we had individuals who participated in a Climate Foundations workshop, for example, from all over the world. We had individuals in Mexico, in Guatemala, and then we also had individuals from Ethiopia and Bangladesh joining us, along with individuals from the United States. And then there were workshops that were a little more, where the content was focused a little bit more on case studies within the US. Particularly, I'm thinking about a COVID-19 economic recovery workshop that we did, which was mostly attended by those who are based in the US, but across the US in terms of states. So we really do get a wonderful mix of participants. And I think based on what Josh said about the content, this is definitely a workshop where there's a lot of great examples of international case studies. And in terms of high school students, I think yes, because I think we do have pre-college offerings as well. But in terms of the applicability of this particular workshop, especially with respect to the materials and the toolkits that have been developed, I don't see a reason why high school students, for example, could not use those toolkits. Josh is nodding, so I'm going to let him weigh in on that as well. I think that we tailor the workshops and the topics for different audiences, but there's no reason why an educator, for example, couldn't take this workshop and bring the content into his or her classroom or school.
Yeah, just echoing what Cassie said, agree completely. I can't speak to the constituency of the participants in the workshop, but in terms of case studies, we'll be using a mix of US-based case studies and international case studies. And hopefully it'll be interesting and useful for people. There are definitely lessons to be extrapolated from each context in terms of the what and the how. And then we can explore as a group how to adapt to everyone's local context.
All right, thank you, Josh. Yeah, thank you for the questions. All right, so thank you so much for joining us. And if you do have additional questions, please get in touch. Josh, thank you for your time. And everyone else, thank you and have a great afternoon or evening. All right, bye everyone.
Bye everyone, thank you.
Thank you.